Welcome to the Government IT Podcast from Converge One Government Solutions, featuring expert discussions around cloud solutions, cybersecurity, modern workplace, enterprise networking, and customer experience for government and civil agencies. And now, here are your hosts, Ryan Heath and Julian Foster.
All right, so Ryan, thank you so much, as usual, for joining me today for the GovIT Podcast. TechTrends focus on the national cybersecurity strategy that was released back in March of 2023. I'm Julian Foster, your host, and I'm joined, as usual, by my co-host, Ryan Heath, who also happens to be our cybersecurity expert, amongst other technological subject areas. Ryan, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
In the last episode, we went over pillars 1 and 2 of the cybersecurity strategy, and today we're going to discuss pillars 3 and 4. Are you ready to dig into it?
Let's do it.
Why don't you give us first a brief overview of Pillar 3, which focuses on collaborating with the private sector to secure critical infrastructure?
Pretty much says it. That's what the pillar is about. It's the collaboration between the U.S. government and the private sector. So really, it involves a lot of sharing of information between all parties, kind of building the partnerships, providing assistance, especially for the critical infrastructure owners and operators. Kind of how do we enhance the security posture? I saw a really good demonstration of this between Lockheed, Juniper, and the DoD for kind of the mission-aware routing that they were doing over 5G. So that just kind of shows, the government coming to play with, hey, here's our issue. This is what it looks like on the battlefield. How would your technology be implemented to help improve that, especially within the communication aspect of it?
So that's a really interesting use case that you gave there. That makes sense. How does the strategy propose to strengthen the cybersecurity and infrastructure security agencies' capabilities in this area?
Well, yeah, so it proposes kind of to be able to strengthen the cybersecurity infrastructure security agency and kind of give them the capabilities that they're looking for. To add additional resources, some additional authority. This is really kind of around kind of increasing the budget, the personnel, expanding the voluntary assistance program as well, kind of enabling them to do a little bit more robust, the cybersecurity services that are kind of critical to the infrastructure that we have. And a lot of that has to do with education as well as kind of providing frameworks.
And the document also mentions establishing a cyber safety review board, also called the CSRB. Can you explain what that board will do and why it's essential to the strategy?
Yeah, so that was kind of created probably a little bit before the Log4j incident. So that was their first kind of realm into getting together and kind of talking through a big cybersecurity related issue, and it's head by a DHS department. So it's kind of really at that point going to be spread against all government agencies. So putting together, post analysis, what you should be able to be put in place across the government platforms, so that type of security will not be penetrated again.
So when you refer to the Log4j incident, you're referring to the Apache vulnerability that was discovered. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that, just to fill our listeners in or viewers in?
Correct. So what the organization did was reach out to about 80 different private industry organizations to kind of come together and figure out what the response needed to be, how they would go through something like this. Because with the Apache vulnerability, it was spread across all industries. So getting something in place, especially on the software side, but the patches in place, identify what needed to be updated was key. So going through that process as quickly as possible, for a brand new agency, actually was a pretty well thought, first experiment for them.
Little trial by fire, right?
Great way to get started, though.
Yeah, it's what usually happens in technology, in the technology sector, at least in my experience, right? So let's move on to Pillar 4 and talk a little bit about how the strategy covers, ensuring that the United States remains a leader and a global leader in cyberspace.
Correct. And then, with that kind of thought, it, really kind of invokes the promoting of having a stable and open internet. What our country's kind of built on is the openness and freedom, and then kind of building those coalitions between the like-minded countries and then holding the malicious actors accountable. So when somebody from the outside does kind of come in and has a big cybersecurity threat, how do we as a nation kind of go through and find out the root cause of that and find the actors and hold them accountable for it. So that's all kind of, part of that Pillar 4 process.
And does the strategy get into, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit more. I know that it's something we are going to cover in a sec. I would imagine that involves a pretty significant amount of collaboration with international partners, right? Because, with an open internet, we have to have collaboration and cooperation with global players in order to keep it open, but secure at the same time, like we talked about last time.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different international cooperations that we're engaging with at this point. So everything from the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, Quad Critical and Emerging Technology Working Group, Trade and Technology Council. So, the U.S. does plan on providing a lot of development into those organizations. So we all have kind of the same principles and responsibility across the board.
So one of the things that we're talking about here, has to deal with, the security of behaviors in cyberspace. And one of the key concerns mentioned in the document is the risk posed by untrusted suppliers, right? So we're not just talking about users and other various kinds of bad actors, but untrusted suppliers in the digital ecosystem specifically. How does the strategy propose to mitigate this risk specifically?
Well, again, kind of goes to that collaboration between the public and private sectors, because their one is to kind of create a little bit more secure, resilient, trustworthy supply chain. So by doing that, you're going to have some of your, suppliers actually be on the state side. So developing those critical technologies domestically is very key. I think we saw a lot of those issues, happen during the pandemic when we couldn't, just on supply chain, just gathering up the chips, et cetera. So kind of investing in those initiatives, as well as open radio access networks, which really kind of penetrate within the 5G space that they're looking into, just provide more secure, telecommunications infrastructure across the board.
Yeah, and one of the things I noticed you just mentioned, the document tends to focus. It has a strong focus on 5G. And next generation wireless networks. Can you tell us more about what the plans are, what the efforts will be made to secure these?
Well, yeah, and that's a very big, effort, and I see a lot of motion in that going on right now, especially this is where I think the U.S. and the private sector are getting together pretty well right now, going through these different strategies, especially when you take it to the battlefield or just bases in general, providing the infrastructure, the framework, the requirements to make all of this work and interoperate correctly. Having that secure network in place is definitely key to making this happen. So kind of promoting, again, that kind of open RAN network, the collaborative and diversity of the suppliers are all kind of key in this. So it's getting the groups together and making sure that we have at least a baseline understanding of what's going to go on, what are the protocols being used, how we're going to secure the network.
And I think there's mention of the Telecommunications and Information Administration being involved in this effort. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so they'll really help with kind of the adoption of the open, the interopt piece, and assist with the standards, on the network side for the protocols.
So I think this takes us to the elephant in the room when it comes to the subject of cybersecurity in this day and age. How do we protect, or how does the strategy propose to address the challenge of protecting sensitive data in cyberspace from foreign adversaries?
So it really kind of points to two executive orders. The first one, securing the information and communications technology and services supply chain, as well as protecting Americans' sensitive data from foreign adversaries. So what they're doing is they're trying to prevent unacceptable and kind of undue risk to our national security by safeguarding information and the communication technologies, services, from the other governments, that might have influence on us. So overall, it's the overarching framework that needs to be put in place. And a lot of that has to do with what they do with these individual kind of groups within the government, putting together their frameworks and their strategy in place on the cyber side. So we can easily bolt that on across the nation from all the different agencies.
One of the things that comes to mind for me when we talk about digital ecosystem and services supply chain, when we talk about supply chain in this context, are we talking about digital products and services supply chain or physical products? The supply chain of physical products, or is it the supply chain specifically related to the components of technology like microchips and semiconductors?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. That's how I'm reading into majority of this information. It's, everything from the chip manufacturing, the chip piece to it, to, FedRAMP clouds, anything that would have an access to the network would be portion of that.
And can you talk a little bit about how the strategy plans to assess its effectiveness? I mean, that's one of the most important parts of any strategy, right? Is planning, what we usually refer to as KPIs, key performance indicators. What's the plan in terms of, assessing the effectiveness of the strategy and the execution of the strategy?
Yeah, so you really have a couple different, federal departments right now that are going to be responsible for that overall strategy and the effectiveness of the strategy. So you have the, Office of the National Cybersecurity Director, along with the National Security Council, and you also have the Office of Management and Budget. So between those three, those are like the big three agencies that are going to be really kind of evaluating the strategy. You got to think putting the strategy in place, and then how do you budget towards that? Who gets the allocated funds? How does that work? Kind of goes through those departments to be able to do it.
One of the walls that we often find ourselves up against in technology projects, whether it's network related, installing new hardware, software development, application development, it always comes down to resources. Usually, time, people, and money, right? So the strategy talks a lot about investment in cybersecurity. How does it address the need for investment, specifically, or do you want to get into that just a little bit?
There's a couple things on that, that I see. From the DoD's perspective, it's, having the TAA equipment is key. You have the APLs, the authorization for the approval list of hardware that you can use. You also have the military deployment guides that are put in place. So there's a lot of things, that give you a roadmap of, whatever your technology issue or solution that you need. There's compatible products that you kind of need to go research on that are, basically proven to be able to have the outcome that you're looking for and that meet all the cybersecurity requirements. So that's kind of one aspect of that. The other aspect is the old legacy networks that do not have all those cybersecurity pieces that were put in place a decade ago, 2 decades ago, highlighting those and going through and moving those, to a modernized, environment. Majority of those things are legacy across the board that just really need to be forklift and upgraded.
Well, that really underscores why a lot of our content recently has been focused on not just the cybersecurity piece, but previously, and we're still sort of putting pieces out related to TDM migrations and network modernization, specifically changing to routing, modern routing and switching networks, what that transition strategy looks like, how to do it elegantly and within budget and time frame. So it sounds like that's what you're touching on there. Is that correct?
Correct. Getting out of that legacy environment that really doesn't have the cybersecurity controls in place. Those were created 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It's getting into that new environment where we can put all the cybersecurity controls in place. That's really what needs to be there across the board for all agencies.
One of the things that I've always run into, being involved in technology for almost 3 decades professionally at this point, is that everything we do is a constantly moving target, right? Especially since the internet came to be in the 90s and just changed everything. And still, everything changes exponentially, right? As soon as we're locked in, and ready for one thing, we're, also trying to prepare for the next thing that's just around the corner. Do you feel like the strategy, as in its current form is really, does it have the kind of agility and flexibility or scalability, I guess, to evolve at the kind of pace that we need for the, to match technological advancements?
Well, that's a great question. Now, I do think with the new kind of agencies and ecosystems that have been put in place, that will help in the future to kind of, be able to migrate those strategies into the new type of strategy that's going to be coming out. No matter what's get put in place now, you see a public framework and strategy that's going to be, something that's documented, but has taken 24 months, let's say, to actually go from, hey, we got the idea, let's go and publish the framework to being published. Then that's going to be out of date in a certain period of time. Right. So it's going to be a constant, yearly, every 2 kind of cycle to keep up with that.
So I guess that's a good way for us to segue into or sort of draw today to a close and tee up our conversation. Next time, we'll be talking about implementation, assessment, and then, digging a little bit deeper into the investment aspect of the strategy.
Looking forward to that one.
Excellent. So that's a good place, I think, for us to stop today then. Okay. I want to thank everybody for joining us. Ryan, as usual, thank you for your insight and expertise. Everyone, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave some comments. Let's get involved in a conversation about the strategy, about, ongoing developments in this space. And Ryan, I look forward to talking to you about this again next week when we dive into the 5th and final pillar of the strategy.
All right. Appreciate it. See you then.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.